The water off Scapa Flow held its dead close. Lieutenant Commander James Holbrook stood on the frost-slicked deck of HMS Reclaim, watching the morning mist cling to the Scottish waters like a shroud. April 1945. The war in Europe was dying, but down there, 200 feet below the surface, the Kriegsmarine's final revenge waited in the dark. U-1055 had gone down 3 days ago. Depth charges from a patrolling corvette had cracked her pressure hull off the Orkney Islands, and she'd settled on the seabed with her secrets locked inside. Naval intelligence wanted those secrets. Code books. Cipher machines. The kind of material that could save lives even as the Reich crumbled. But the Germans knew their boats would be salvaged. They'd prepared for it. "Sir." Petty Officer Davies approached, his breath visible in the cold air. "Diver Thompson's ready. Standard sweep configuration." Holbrook didn't turn. His eyes remained fixed on the dark water. "Belay that." Davies hesitated. "Sir, I want Charlie Moss." The silence that followed was heavy with meaning. Charlie Moss wasn't Standard anything. He was the diver they called when Standard got men killed. 3 tours in the Mediterranean. Alexandria, Malta, Taranto. He'd cleared German demolition charges from captured Italian cruisers, worked blind in flooded compartments filled with fuel oil and corpses, defused pressure-activated mines that would detonate if you breathed wrong. And he'd lost 2 fingers on his left hand doing it. "Moss is off rotation, sir," Davies said carefully. "Medical recommended." "I know what medical recommended." Holbrook finally turned. His face was lined, aged beyond his 34 years. "Get him anyway." 20 minutes later, Charlie Moss stood in the cramped briefing room, still wearing his civilian clothes, worn trousers and a fisherman's sweater that smelled of tobacco and salt. He was 42, too old for this work by regulation standards. His hands were scarred, his left missing the ring and pinky fingers. But his eyes were clear and sharp. Holbrook spread the reconnaissance photographs across the table. Grainy images of U-1055's conning tower, taken by a diver yesterday. Thompson, the same diver who should have gone down today but wouldn't now. "They found this." Holbrook pointed to a barely visible detail near the forward hatch. A thin wire, almost invisible in the murky water. Moss leaned closer. Said nothing. Thompson saw it, backed off immediately. "Smart lad." Holbrook's finger moved to another photograph. "But look here. And here. And here. 4 more wires. Different angles. Different positions." "Redundancy," Moss said quietly. His voice had the flat quality of a man who'd seen too much. "They're learning." "We lost 3 men in Wilhelmshaven last month," Holbrook continued. "Sabotage charges wired to the main hatch of U-973. First man through triggered a delayed fuse. Compartment flooded, trapping the team inside." He paused. "They drowned in the dark, Charlie. Clawing at steel they couldn't see." Moss's jaw tightened. He knew those men. Had trained with them. "Intelligence says the Kriegsmarine's been issuing new protocols," Holbrook went on. "Every U-boat commander scuttling his vessel is required to set traps. Not just explosives, psychological ones. Pressure switches. Anti-tamper devices. Things designed specifically for us." "They know we're coming," Moss said. "They're counting on it." Holbrook slid one more photograph across the table. This one showed the interior of a salvaged German demolition charge. The mechanism was elegant, terrifying. A mercury tilt switch connected to a secondary trigger. Move it one way, nothing happens. Move it the other way, even a fraction of an inch. "We can't go in blind anymore," Holbrook said. "And we can't rely on standard procedures. The Germans are adapting faster than we are." Moss studied the photographs in silence. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window frames. The sound of waves against the hull was rhythmic, hypnotic. "What's the plan?" he finally asked. Holbrook reached into his coat and pulled out something small, roughly the size of a torch. But it wasn't standard issue. The casing had been modified, machined by hand. The lens was tinted amber, and there were additional components soldered along the side, wiring that shouldn't be there, switches that served no obvious purpose. "This," Holbrook said, "is your edge." Moss took the device, turned it over in his scarred hands. It was heavier than it looked. "What am I looking at?" "A torch that doesn't just illuminate," Holbrook said. "It reveals." The next hour was spent in the workshop beneath the main deck, where Holbrook explained what Naval Intelligence's Technical Division had developed in absolute secrecy. The modified light used a dual wavelength system. Standard white light for navigation, yes, but the amber filter could be activated separately, producing a specific frequency that made certain materials fluoresce. German demolition charges used a particular type of copper wire for their firing circuits. Under normal light, invisible in murky water. Under this specific wavelength. "It glows," Holbrook demonstrated, holding a sample of the wire under the amber beam. Even in the well-lit workshop, the wire shimmered with an eerie greenish luminescence. "Christ," Moss whispered. "They don't know we have this," Holbrook said. "The technology's experimental. You're the first field test." "Comforting. There's more." Holbrook adjusted the torch's side switches. "This dial controls intensity. Too bright and you'll alert any light-sensitive triggers. Too dim and you won't see the wires at all. You'll need to calibrate it on the way down, adapt to the visibility conditions." Moss nodded slowly. "And if it fails?" "Then you're working blind, same as always." The weight of it settled over them. This wasn't just about recovering documents anymore. This was about proving a new method, a new way to fight an enemy that had learned to kill from beyond the grave. "When do I dive?" Moss asked. "Tide turns in 2 hours. Water will be calmer, visibility slightly better." Holbrook met his eyes. "But Charlie, if you see anything you don't like, anything that feels wrong, you surface. Immediately. No heroics." Moss almost smiled. "Since when have I been heroic?" "Since you volunteered for this bloody job." At 1,400 hours, Moss descended. The North Atlantic swallowed him in stages. First the light, gray sky fading to green, then to blue-black. Then the temperature, cold sinking through his dry suit like knives. Then sound, the mechanical rasp of his own breathing through the DSEA rebreather, the creak of the descending line, and below all of that, silence. The kind of silence that pressed against your skull. He checked his depth gauge. 50 feet. The modified torch was clipped to his belt, inactive for now. He was using the descent to calibrate his breathing, settle his heart rate. Fear was the real killer down here. Fear made you use oxygen faster, made your hands shake, made you miss details that could save your life. At 75 feet, the wreck appeared below him like a ghost materializing from nothing. U-1055 lay on her port side, settling into the silt. Her conning tower pointed sideways, the diving planes bent at unnatural angles. Depth charge damage had torn open her aft section. He could see the jagged metal, the exposed machinery. Fish moved through the wreckage, oblivious to what it represented. Death. Terror. Drowning men screaming in the dark. Moss pushed the thought away. He reached the seabed at 190 feet. The wreck loomed above him, massive and wrong. Submarines weren't meant to be seen like this. Horizontal, violated, stripped of the power that made them apex predators. He unclipped the modified torch. Standard white light first. He swept the beam across the forward section, looking for the hatch. There, 20 feet ahead, partially buried in silt. The photos had been accurate. He moved closer, each fin stroke deliberate. Silt rose in clouds with every movement, reducing visibility to inches. He paused, waiting for it to settle. Breathing slow. Counting. The hatch came into focus. And there, just visible in the white light, was the first wire Thompson had spotted. Moss switched to amber. The water seemed to shift, colors muting to shades of gold and shadow. And the wire blazed. A brilliant green thread cutting across the hatch mechanism, so bright it seemed impossible anyone could miss it. But in white light, it had been nearly invisible. His heart rate kicked up. Easy, easy. He followed the wire with the amber beam, tracking its path. It ran to the hatch wheel, then disappeared into a sealed junction box welded to the hull. German engineering. Precise. Deadly. He swept the beam wider. 2 more wires appeared, glowing that same spectral green. Different angles. Different trigger points. Bloody hell, he breathed into his rebreather. The Kriegsmarine hadn't just set one trap. They'd created a web. Moss hung suspended in the dark water, the amber glow of his modified torch painting the U-boat's hull in alien colors. The 3 wires he'd identified formed a triangular pattern around the forward hatch, elegant, deliberate, and absolutely lethal. He needed to think like the German who'd set these traps. Put yourself in his boots, his instructor had told him years ago during mine disposal training. He's not just trying to kill you. He's trying to kill your confidence, your procedure, your certainty. He wants you to second-guess everything. Moss switched back to white light and withdrew his dive slate. With the grease pencil attached by a cord, he sketched the wire positions, marking angles and distances. The cold water made his remaining fingers clumsy, but the work was meditative, focusing. Wire 1, hatch wheel to junction box. Likely pressure sensitive. Turn the wheel without disarming, and wire 2, running along the hatch seal. Anti-tamper? Trip wire? Could be either. Wire 3. This one was different. It disappeared into the silt beneath the hatch itself. Pressure plate, maybe. Step on the wrong spot while working, and the whole thing goes up. He made his decision. Surface. Reassess. Get Holbrook's input. But as he turned to begin his ascent, something caught his eye. A 4th wire, this one so fine it was barely visible even under amber light. It ran from behind the conning tower, down along the hull, and terminated at. His blood went cold. The wire ended at his descending line. They'd booby-trapped the goddamn approach route. Moss froze. His breathing quickened. He could hear it rasping in the rebreather, too fast, too loud. He forced himself to slow down. Think. The wire was connected to his line, but it hadn't detonated when he'd descended. That meant it wasn't a direct trigger. It was something else. He moved closer, the amber light revealing the connection point. A small metal clip, German manufacture, attached to the descending rope. And from there, the wire ran to a canister half buried in silt near the U-boat's hull. A delayed charge. The mechanism was simple, horrifying in its elegance. Descend the line. Nothing happens. Work on the hatch. Nothing happens. But when you start to ascend, when you pull yourself up that rope thinking you're safe, the movement triggers a timer. Maybe 30 seconds. Maybe a minute. Just enough time to get 20-30 feet off the bottom before the canister would detonate. Debris would shred you. If you survived that, the shock wave in the water would rupture your lungs, your eardrums. You'd sink back down, drowning in your own blood while your teammates watched from the surface, helpless. Psychological warfare at its finest. Moss made a new notation on his slate, ascent line compromised. He had 2 choices. Try to defuse the canister now, or find another way up. The first option meant working blind on an unknown German explosive device 200 feet down. The second meant free swimming to the surface without a guideline, risking decompression sickness, possibly getting lost in the dark if his compass failed. He chose the canister. Moving through the water felt like walking through a nightmare. Every fin stroke raised silt, reducing visibility to near zero. Moss worked by touch and memory, keeping the amber light focused on the wire leading to the canister. He couldn't afford to lose it. The canister emerged from the silt like a grave opening up. German lettering stenciled on the side. Sprengstoff, Vorsicht. Explosives, caution. As if the warning mattered to a man who'd already found it. Moss set down his torch, angling it to illuminate the work area. Then he removed his dive knife, a short, sturdy blade designed for cutting rope and wire, not combat. His scarred left hand was nearly useless for fine manipulation, so everything depended on his right. The canister had 2 access points. A main fuse housing on top, and a secondary panel on the side. German bomb disposal doctrine, he'd studied it obsessively after Wilhelmshaven, dictated that the main housing was usually a dummy, designed to kill curious diffusers. The real mechanism was in the secondary panel. But sometimes they reversed it. He examined both under the amber light. The main housing showed scratches around the screws, barely visible. Someone had opened it recently. The secondary panel was pristine, untouched. They want me to think the secondary is safe, Moss thought. Which means the main is probably the dummy, which means they're counting on me to be clever and go for the secondary, which is actually the real trigger. He stopped himself. Second-guessing was exactly what they wanted. This was the psychological trap within the physical trap. Trust your training. Trust your instincts. He chose the secondary panel. Working 200 feet down in near-freezing water with a rebreather mask limiting your peripheral vision and 3 fingers on one hand was an exercise in controlled desperation. The screws were corroded, Baltic salt water, different from the Atlantic, but the result was the same. Moss used his knife tip to chip away at the corrosion, then tried the screwdriver from his tool pouch. The first screw wouldn't budge. He applied pressure, carefully. Too much and the head would strip. Too little and nothing would happen. It turned. Half a rotation, then seized. More corrosion clearing. Another attempt. The screw came free. 3 more to go. His air supply gauge showed 70 minutes remaining. Plenty of time, in theory. But time underwater was elastic, treacherous. What felt like 5 minutes could be 20. What felt like 20 could be 5. The second screw came easier. The third fought him, and for a terrifying moment he thought it had stripped. But no, just corroded worse than the others. The fourth screw fell away into the silt. Moss paused. This was the moment. Opening the panel would either reveal the mechanism he could defuse, or trigger the backup he hadn't anticipated. 50-50, he thought grimly. He lifted the panel. Inside was a clockwork timer connected to a pressure cylinder of compressed air. The mechanism was beautiful in its precision, German engineering at its finest. When the descending line was pulled upward with sufficient force, the movement would open a valve. Compressed air would flow into the clockwork, starting the timer. 30 seconds later, a spring-loaded hammer would strike the detonator. But the timer wasn't running. Not yet. Moss allowed himself a single moment of relief, then got back to work. Defusing it meant disconnecting the pressure cylinder without triggering the backup pressure switch he could now see welded to the valve. One switch monitored the line's tension. The other monitored any attempt to tamper with the first. Elegant. Redundant. Deadly. He needed to bypass both simultaneously. From his tool pouch, Moss withdrew 2 small clamps, modified from surgical hemostats, designed for exactly this kind of work. The first clamp would hold the tension switch in its neutral position. The second would prevent the tamper switch from detecting the disconnect. But his left hand couldn't grip properly. 3 fingers weren't enough. He tried anyway. The first clamp slipped, floating away into the dark water before he could catch it. "Shit!" he hissed into the rebreather. "One clamp left. Not enough to secure both switches. Think. There had to be another way." Moss examined the mechanism again under the amber light. The pressure cylinder fed into the clockwork through a single copper line. If he could freeze that line, stop the airflow without disconnecting anything. He reached for his dive suit's emergency CO2 inflation cartridge. It was meant for buoyancy emergencies, one-time use only. But CO2 compressed and released would flash freeze anything it touched for a few critical seconds. Enough time to cut the copper line. He positioned the cartridge nozzle against the copper tubing, just upstream from the clockwork. Took a breath. Steadied himself. And released the CO2. The effect was instantaneous. Ice crystals formed on the copper line, frost spreading across the metal in a white shell. Moss grabbed his wire cutters, positioned them on the frozen section, and cut. Nothing exploded. The pressure cylinder hissed softly, compressed air venting harmlessly into the water. The clockwork sat frozen, its mechanism intact but now completely isolated from the trigger system. Moss sagged against the U-boat's hull, exhaustion washing over him. One trap down. 3 more to go. He surfaced 40 minutes later, ascending slowly to avoid the bends. When his head broke through the water into grey Scottish daylight, a cheer went up from the Reclaim's deck. Davies helped him aboard, and someone thrust a cup of rum into his hands. Holbrook appeared moments later. "Report." Moss took a swallow of rum first. Then, 4 traps. Ascent line was rigged with a delayed charge. I've defused it. The hatch itself has 3 separate wire systems, all glowing like Christmas under your fancy torch. Can you clear them? I can try. But, sir. Moss met his commanding officer's eyes. They're not just trying to protect documents. They're trying to perfect a method. Every U-boat that goes down now is a laboratory. They're testing what works, what kills us, what makes us hesitate. Holbrook's expression darkened. How many boats are out there right now, scuttled or depth-charged, waiting for us? Intelligence estimates 47 in operational theaters where we'll attempt salvage. 47 potential death traps. 47 refinements to their technique, Moss corrected. By the time we get to the last boat, they'll have perfected it. The deck fell silent except for the wind and waves. Then we perfect our response faster, Holbrook said finally. Next dive is in 3 hours. Rest. Eat. Then go back down and show me if that light of yours is worth what we paid for it. Moss nodded. He was already mentally preparing for the hatch traps, visualizing the wire patterns he'd mapped, planning his approach. But in the back of his mind, a darker thought lingered. Somewhere in Germany, in some U-boat commander's training facility, men were designing tomorrow's trap. And tomorrow's. And tomorrow's. An arms race conducted in darkness and silence, 200 feet below the waves. The second descent was different. Moss carried the weight of knowledge now. Every trap cleared on the ascent line was one more variable controlled, but the hatch itself remained pristine, untouched. 47 minutes of bottom time available. 3 wire systems to defeat. And somewhere in that maze of copper and malice, the real killer waiting. He reached the U-boat at 1,647 hours. The underwater visibility had worsened, afternoon currents stirring up silt from the seabed, reducing his effective range to perhaps 6 feet even with the torch. It was like working inside a cloud that tasted of rust and death. Moss activated the amber filter. The 3 wires blazed into visibility, and now, with a better angle and clearer focus, he could see the complete picture. Wire 1 ran from the hatch wheel to the junction box, yes, but there was a secondary branch he'd missed before. It looped back on itself, creating a circuit. Break the wire, and the circuit opens. Opening circuit triggers. He followed the trace. A demolition charge the size of a coffee tin, wedged into the conning tower's base. Enough explosive to tear the forward section apart, to send shrapnel through the water like grape shot. Anyone within 20 feet would be shredded. Wire 2, the one running along the hatch seal, terminated at a different device. This one was smaller, more sophisticated. A pressure sensor connected to what looked like an adapted torpedo detonator. German ingenuity. If you managed to bypass wire 1 and actually started opening the hatch, changing the pressure differential between inside and outside the sub would trigger this backup. And wire 3, disappearing into the silt beneath the hatch. Moss carefully excavated around it with his dive knife, moving silt one handful at a time. The work was agonizingly slow. Each movement had to be gentle, deliberate. One wrong scrape could shift something, complete a circuit, end everything. The wire led to a mine. Not a naval mine, something smaller, more personal. A British Mark VII anti-personnel mine, likely captured and repurposed. The Germans had placed it directly beneath where a diver would naturally position himself to work on the hatch. Kneel down, apply your weight to that specific spot, and spring-loaded strikers would slam into the detonator. Christ Jesus, Moss breathed. 3 separate systems. 3 separate triggers. 3 different ways to die. And they were interconnected. He could see it now under the amber light, hair-thin wires linking all 3 devices in a web of mutual destruction. Disarm one wrong, and the others would cascade. It was magnificent. It was monstrous. It was exactly the kind of problem Charlie Moss had spent 20 years learning to solve. He started with the pressure sensor on wire 2, the hatch seal trap. It was the newest, the most sophisticated, and therefore the most vulnerable to a technique the Germans wouldn't expect. From his tool pouch, Moss withdrew a small hand pump, designed for inflating lift bags, but adapted for his purposes. He connected a thin tube to it and carefully worked the tube's end into the hatch seal, right next to the pressure sensor. The theory was simple. The sensor measured pressure differential, inside pressure versus outside pressure. If he could very slowly, incrementally, equalize that pressure before opening the hatch, the sensor would never detect a change. But it required precision. Too fast, and the sensor's needle would swing, triggering the detonator. Too slow, and he'd run out of air before making progress. Moss began pumping. Each stroke was measured, timed with his breathing. Pump. Wait. Check the sensor through the amber light, looking for any movement in the needle. Pump. Wait. Check. 5 minutes passed. The needle hadn't moved. 10 minutes. Still steady. His air supply, 31 minutes remaining. 15 minutes into the equalization, something changed. The sensor's needle quivered. Just a fraction, barely visible. But movement nonetheless. Moss stopped pumping. Waited. Watched. The needle settled back to neutral. He'd found the threshold. Any more pressure and the sensor would register it. Any less and the hatch wouldn't budge when he tried to open it. He was balanced on a knife's edge. Time to shift tactics. He withdrew a jeweler's screwdriver from his pouch, so small it was almost comical, but perfect for precision work. The pressure sensor's housing had 4 tiny screws. If he could remove the housing without disturbing the internal mechanism, he could access the wiring directly. Working underwater with tools designed for a workbench was an exercise in creative profanity. The screws were microscopic. His thick dive gloves made fine manipulation impossible. Moss stripped off the right glove, accepting the immediate bite of freezing water against his bare skin. His fingers would go numb in minutes, but he'd have the dexterity he needed. First screw out. Second screw. Stuck. He applied pressure, felt it give slightly, backed off before stripping it. More pressure. Different angle. It turned. Third screw out. Fourth screw, dropped it. The tiny piece of metal tumbled away into the silt, lost forever. Bloody, Moss cut himself off. 3 screws would have to do. He pried the housing loose. Inside was a marvel of German precision, a pressure diaphragm connected to a mechanical switch which connected to the detonator circuit. The tolerances were so fine that even a strong current could theoretically set it off. But the circuit had a weakness. All circuits did. Moss traced the wiring with the amber light. Power came from a small battery pack. The switch controlled current flow. The detonator completed the circuit. Standard design, just miniaturized and sensitized. He needed to interrupt power without triggering the switch. From his pouch, alligator clips with insulated wire. He attached one clip to the power line before it reached the switch. Attached the second clip to the same line after the switch. Now current had 2 paths, through the switch or through his bypass wire. Carefully, so carefully his hands trembled despite the cold, he cut the original wire between his 2 clips. Current flowed through the bypass. The switch was now isolated, harmless. The detonator remained connected but inert. Wire 2, defeated. Air remaining, 18 minutes. Wire 1, the circuit loop to the coffee tin charge, was next. This one was cruder, older technology. Less sophisticated meant less vulnerable to clever bypasses, but also more predictable. The junction box was corroded shut. Moss used his knife to chip away at the seal, exposing the interior. Inside, a simple mechanical relay. Break the circuit, the relay opens, current flows to the detonator. Unless you replaced the broken circuit before it fully opened. This was a 2-handed job. One hand to cut the wire. The other hand to simultaneously complete the circuit with a jumper cable, maintaining current flow through the transition. But Moss only had one good hand. He wedged his tool pouch against the U-boat's hull, creating a makeshift work surface. Placed the jumper cable's alligator clips in his mouth, ready to deploy. Positioned his wire cutters on wire 1 with his right hand. This would require perfect timing. Cut the wire, grab the jumper cable from his mouth, attach both ends before the relay fully opened. Maybe 2 seconds to complete the entire sequence. He rehearsed the motion 3 times without actually cutting. Muscle memory. Visualization. Then did it for real. Cut, wire separated, relay starting to open. Grabbed jumper cable from mouth. First clip attached to wire end A. Relay half open, current dropping. Second clip to wire end B. Circuit complete. The relay stopped mid-opening, confused. Current still flowing. Detonator inactive. Moss allowed himself 3 heartbeats of relief. Then used those precious seconds to permanently secure the jumper cable with electrical tape from his pouch. Wire 1. Defeated. Air remaining, 9 minutes. The anti-personnel mine beneath the hatch was the final obstacle, and it was designed to kill him through sheer persistence. Even if he bypassed the wire somehow, he still needed to physically work in the exact spot where the mine was buried. Weight plus pressure equals detonation. No way around it. Unless he wasn't there when the weight was applied. Moss excavated the mine completely, exposing its full shape. British Mark 7. Confirmed. He knew this device intimately, had trained on them, practiced defusing them in the safe environment of a classroom before the war had made such training lethally relevant. The Mark 7 had 3 pressure plates arranged in a triangle. Step on any one. Nothing. Step on 2 simultaneously. Still nothing. But step on all 3, or apply sufficient weight to depress the center, and spring-loaded strikers would fire. The genius of Wire 3's placement was that it ran across the pressure zone. Disturb the mine trying to move it, and you'd trigger it. Try to work around it, and you'd eventually put weight on it anyway. Moss needed to disable the strikers without moving the mine. He withdrew his last specialized tool, a long, thin probe made of non-magnetic steel. The probe could slide between the pressure plates, reach the striker mechanism inside, and, if he was very lucky and very skilled, jam the strikers in their neutral position. This required working entirely by feel. The amber light could show him the external housing, but the internal mechanism was invisible, hidden behind steel and explosive material. Moss inserted the probe into the gap between pressure plates 1 and 2. Felt resistance. Adjusted angle. Pushed deeper. Something inside clicked. He froze. Waited. No explosion. He continued, working the probe deeper, feeling for the striker springs. Metal rasped against metal, a sound he felt more than heard, transmitted through the probe into his hand. There. The probe contacted something that had to be the first striker. He applied lateral pressure, trying to bend the striker out of alignment with its firing pin. The metal resisted. More pressure. The probe flexed. God, please don't let it snap. The striker gave way, bending just enough to jam against its housing. One striker disabled. The Mark 7 had 2 more. Air remaining, 4 minutes. Moss worked faster now, abandoning caution for speed. The second striker jammed easier than the first. The third required brute force. He torqued the probe so hard it bent permanently, but the striker moved out of alignment. 3 strikers disabled. In theory, the mine was now inert. In theory, he could kneel on it and the strikers wouldn't fire because they were mechanically prevented from reaching their firing pins. Theory and practice underwater at depth with German explosives were 2 very different things. Air remaining, 2 minutes. No time for hesitation. No time for second-guessing. Moss positioned himself over the hatch, his weight distributed across the mine's footprint. He could feel the metal plates beneath his knees through his dry suit, cold, unyielding. The strikers were mere inches below him, held immobile by a bent probe and hope. He reached for the hatch wheel. And from somewhere in the dark water behind him, he heard a sound. Metal on metal. Deliberate. Regular. Tap, tap, tap. Someone, something, was signaling. Moss spun in the water, the amber light sweeping across the wreck. Nothing. Just the U-boat's hull stretching away into darkness, and beyond it the empty void of the North Atlantic. Tap, 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 there. The sound was coming from inside the submarine. Impossible. The boat had been down for 3 days. No one could survive that long. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Not someone alive. Someone dead. Bodies inside the flooded compartments, shifting with the current. Equipment coming loose. Metal debris settling. Or the tapping was another trap. A mechanical device designed to prey on exactly this reaction, the instinct to investigate, to rescue, to respond to what sounded like a human signal. Tap, tap, tap. Morse code? Maybe. He tried to parse it. TTT. Or just random debris. Air remaining. 90 seconds. Holbrook's words echoed in his memory. If you see anything you don't like, anything that feels wrong, you surface immediately. This felt wrong. Everything about it felt wrong. But the hatch was right there. Clear of traps. Ready to open. The documents intelligence needed were inside, potentially 30 feet from where he knelt. Tap, tap, tap. A choice, surface with nothing, or push forward into unknown danger with air running out. Charlie Moss had never surfaced empty-handed. He turned back to the hatch wheel, gripped it with both hands, his right strong, his left clumsy with its missing fingers, and pulled. The wheel didn't budge. Of course. 3 days underwater, pressure differential, corrosion. He needed leverage. He unclipped his dive knife, wedged it into the wheel's spokes, and used it as a lever arm. Pulled again. Harder. His air alarm started beeping, 60 seconds remaining. The wheel shifted. Quarter turn. Half turn. Inside the submarine, the tapping stopped. Silence. Just his breathing in the rebreather, ragged now, consuming oxygen faster as exertion increased. Full turn. The hatch cracked open. Water rushed out, compressed air that had been trapped inside for 3 days, venting in a violent exhalation. The current caught Moss, tried to pull him away from the wreck. He grabbed the hatch rim, held on. The venting stopped. The hatch hung open. Dark water inside. The amber light revealed a nightmare. The interior of the U-boat was a tomb. Bodies floated in the flooded compartments, faces bloated beyond recognition, uniforms shredded by pressure and decay. Equipment drifted in the current. Papers swirled like snow. And there, just visible through the forward hatch, the control room, where the documents would be. Code books in their waterproof safe. Cipher machines bolted to the navigation table. Air remaining, 30 seconds. Too close. He'd cut it too close. Moss made his decision. Surface now, return with fresh tanks, complete the mission properly. He released the hatch and kicked upward, and a hand closed around his ankle.